So as many of you may have heard, there was a tragic shooting in Las Vegas, leaving at least 59 people dead, surpassing the previous record of 49 made by Omar Mateen, making this officially the deadliest mass shooting we've ever seen in modern American history. As expected, before the bodies were even cold, the left began using this for their political agenda. Now, I'm not going to get into the debate of gun control. While I do think some restrictions may be necessary, I think the ones we're using right now aren't effective. And we should be thinking about what kinds of gun control we're using, rather than whether we need more of it or not. Of course, one thing the left absolutely has to bring up in response to a tragedy like this is the perpetrator's skin color. One frequent claim I've heard is that the reason why Trump, the right, and/or society in general doesn't consider this to be a terrorist attack is because the shooter was white, and if he had been a Muslim, it would have been labeled a terrorist attack. Where do I even begin with this? First off, I'd like to address the conflation they're trying to make between race and religion. The claim here is that when a Muslim commits an act of terrorism, the Muslim community is expected to come out and condemn it, but when a white person does it, white people as a whole aren't blamed. To an extent this is true, but that's because being white isn't an ideology, it's a trait you're born with. Being white, in and of itself, cannot make you more likely to be part of a mass shooting, an act of terrorism, or anything like that. And while joining an ideology doesn't inherently mean you're going to commit an act of terrorism, in the very least it can, not necessarily will, but can give you a motive. Now I wholeheartedly agree that not all Muslims are terrorists and individual Muslims should not be persecuted for the actions of others. But trying to conflate race with an ideology is a false equivalency and only makes you look foolish. So making satirical statements like ban all white men doesn't make sense because you're trying to satirize the logic of banning people of a certain ideology by equating it to banning them based on skin color. Regardless of how you feel about the Muslim ban, which isn't even a Muslim ban, trying to equate it to banning people based solely on skin color is illogical. Some people don't even seem to realize that the guy being white doesn't automatically mean the attack couldn't have been Islamic, and we'll get more into that in just a bit. The media is criticizing Trump for not calling it a terrorist attack, but there's a perfectly good reason for that. At this point in time, we legitimately do not know if this was, in fact, a terrorist attack. That's because by definition, a terrorist attack needs to have some kind of political motivation behind it. What was this guy's motivation? Well, that's just it. We don't know. At this point in time, there are only two plausible motives, but neither of them have enough backing to start making assertions. The first plausibility is Islamic, which is evidenced by the fact that ISIS took credit for the attack. However, it has to be noted that ISIS has made false claims in the past and could just be doing this to scare people. There's also been no evidence found that he had at any point converted to Islam. That's right, white people are capable of converting to Islam. But again, so far that doesn't seem to be the case here. The other possibility is left-wing, which is evidenced by the fact that a majority of people at a country music concert are likely to be right-wingers. But this obviously isn't enough to make a strong case for it. What people don't seem to understand is that terrorism isn't simply a buzzword we use to designate horrible acts of violence, it has a meaning to it. Even if we assume for all intents and purposes that he did have a motive and that it was political, it doesn't help us if we don't know what it is. We have to actually know what we're fighting before we can fight it. I can also guarantee you right now, if information came out that did implicate this to be an Islamic terrorist attack, the media would then start attacking Trump and/or society at large for only calling it a terrorist attack when it turned out to be Islamic. When in reality, in that scenario, it'd be called a terrorist attack because we'd know it was a terrorist attack. This is also not a case of white privilege as so many are claiming it is. Take for example the North Park Elementary School shooting in San Bernardino. The guy who carried that attack out was black, and we barely heard about it. Also for example the Tennessee church shooting. The guy who did that was black, and we barely heard about it. In the case of the latter, you could argue that it was an act of terrorism since the guy specifically wanted to kill white people as revenge for Dylan Roof. In the case of the former, however, there is no evidence to suggest it was an act of terrorism, because all we know about him is he apparently had family issues. And now here's where things get a little bit tricky. One common claim is that when it's a white guy, we assume there were mental health issues involved as opposed to terrorism. But the thing is, it can be both. Take for example Dylan Roof. He was apparently on antidepressants at the time, a factor involved in a lot of violent shootings of which the media will never acknowledge. But because he also had a clear motive, it's still an act of terrorism. Another example of terrorism committed by a white person would be Timothy McVeigh, but unlike what the left proclaims, it was not an act of Christian terrorism. While Timothy McVeigh was raised Catholic, he struggled with his faith, and even if he was religious at the time, he clearly stated that his motives were anti-government in nature. And that's another thing that should be noted. Just because a person is part of an ideology doesn't mean that they're acting in the name of said ideology when they commit an attack. I imagine some will argue that when it's a Muslim, people are far more quick to come to the conclusion that it was acted in the name of Islam. And yes, that is unfortunately true, but in all fairness, how often is it that we see an attack committed by a Muslim that wasn't related to Islam? One of the few examples I could find was this attack in Munich by a guy who apparently viewed ISIS in a very negative light. He compared them to Turkey, a nation he demonstrated much contempt for. All I'm saying is there's a bit more plausibility for believing an attack was carried out with a particular motive when there have already been many attacks committed with that same motive. With all that being said, what do we call the Las Vegas shooting if not an act of terrorism? With all the information we have, it may very well be something worse than terrorism. It could have been the actions of a man who simply decided to himself that he was going to go out and kill people for no reason. An act of nothing but pure evil. So in conclusion, not all Muslims are terrorists, and it is absolutely wrong and despicable to treat individual Muslims as though they bear the responsibility for what others have done. But to conflate race with an ideology is an asinine attempt to deny concerns for a problem. Being white is not an ideology, and you can't act as though it somehow leads to violence unless you are, in fact, a racist. And being angry at someone simply because they didn't use a word that doesn't even accurately describe an event is a foolish argument. Thank you all for watching, and try to stay safe. May the victims of this tragedy rest in peace.